The clean-up job would turn out to be possibly second only to body recovery duty in terms of being a job that nobody wanted to get assigned to. Imagine for a moment a thick soup of oil, paper, ink, clothing, raw meat, and other fresh provisions, and worse, that had all been left to collect together in semi-warm water, all enclosed in a large metal container that had then been subjected to heating by first fire, and then repeated warm Hawaiian days. Then left to ferment for over a month. And then, with most of the water drained away, and all the remaining solid and semi-liquid mass collecting together in pools and heaps across multiple decks, still in a relatively enclosed environment. About the only small mercy was that since the ship was still not on quite an even keel, once the larger items had been removed, like half carcasses of cows and sheep, the rest could be hosed down with hot water jets, and the resulting sludge collected at the lower end of the ship, where a skimming unit could come in to collect and dispose of it. Anchors were run out to stabilise the ship when it got free, and to stop it drifting away. It wasn't getting any easier, though. Several men were killed by concentrated hydrogen sulfide gas, which was a product of the various organic materials aboard decomposing, which had then been concentrated under pressure in the water, and then been released when a new compartment was being inspected to see if it needed pumping out. As a result, further ventilation equipment was brought in, and the work continued. By the second week of the month, the stern had risen several feet, and the whole ship was now rising at the rate of about a foot per day. But due to the slowing of the work to account for the hydrogen sulfide issue and the considerable amount of water left in compartments just inside of the big patch, it wasn't likely the ship would reach a draft that was sufficient to get it into Dry Dock 1. Luckily though, Dry Dock 2 could take deeper draft ships, and with that dock having recently cleared the torpedo-damaged carrier Saratoga for passage back to the continental United States, the Nevada preferred for relocation to the new dock. As the sun rose on the 18th, the pumps aboard Nevada were on up to full power, the tugs came alongside, and the ship began the run for the dry dock. It was considerably down by the bow due to the body of water that was still inside due to the torpedo hole, but with some of the aft tanks flooded to get the whole ship to rotate slightly so the very tip of the bow rose just a fraction, by 10 o'clock in the morning she was over the threshold of Dry Dock 2, the dock gates were closed, and water began to be pumped out. As the water level, and thus the pressure, decreased, the pumps could also start clearing out some of the water in the bow compartments, levelling out the ship so that it could be settled onto the dry dock blocks. The work thus continued apace, but as they reached further down into the ship, it became a much grimmer task. Almost 50 of the ship's crew had never been found after the attack, and soon enough, on the second deck level, the repair crews began to find what was left of many of these unfortunate men. Pumping slowed at the third deck level to allow for recovery of the remains, which, grim as it sounds, were easier to float into bags than to recover in bits from a drained deck. This effort recovered about half of the missing crew and allowed the ship to break free of the mud completely just after March the 20th. By the 29th, only 16 men were left unaccounted for, and after a thorough search of the remaining third deck area, the pumps were ramped back up again. By the end of the month, the ship only showed a slight list to port, although with a draft of 43 feet, there was still some work to be done. Luckily, most of the oil had been taken out of the ship during the pause at the third deck level, so the engine room salvage efforts would only have to deal with massive saltwater contamination instead of all of that, plus oil sludge. By the 3rd of April, the ship was riding high enough to get into a dock. But now there was no space available. Lexington had arrived earlier in the day for refit in Dry Dock 2, and a cruiser plus 2 destroyers occupied Dry Dock 1. Work had progressed at almost warp speed on Dry Dock 3, but Dry Dock 3 had been designed to handle smaller ships and was too small to fit the battleship. Instead, they would have to wait for a few days until after the 8th, when Lexington was due to head over to the fitting out and repair basin. Whilst they were waiting, the anchor chain that had been used months previously to try and keep the ship closer to the quay was unwrapped from around the barbette of turret 1, and various plates used to seal the upper areas of the ship, such as the casemates, were removed to reduce overall weight, since now those areas were reasonably above the waterline again. Clearing of the magazines, cleaning of the engine rooms, and the short straw job of emptying the meat locker were also undertaken, with a random large explosion, probably caused by a pocket of uncovered aviation gasoline that had fumigated, adding to a bit of excitement to the proceedings. Although 5 men were injured, luckily nobody was killed. More seriously, the explosion blew off a patch that sent water back into numerous cleared compartments, and that in turn sent the bow plunging 5 feet further down. Luckily, all the pumps and crew were called on, and the area was isolated, repatched, and pumped out again over the next few days, with one of the conning towers lifted off the ship to assist with the weight issue. And so it was that on the 9th of April, the California became the second battleship to be successfully salvaged from the depths, entering Dry Dock 2 at around 11 o'clock in the morning, joined in the dock by the small tug Sotoyomo, which had been recovered from next to the floating dry dock YFD-2. Preparations were made for the now, unfortunately, familiar task of clearing out a waterlogged ship and, of course, the grim task of recovering bodies. More crew were unaccounted for on West Virginia than had been the case on California or Nevada, and the divers had, for the first few weeks, reported faint tapping sounds coming from within the hull. But by mid-January, these noises had gradually faded away to a grim silence. By mid-April, the remaining sections of patching were being placed and ammunition was being removed from the various turrets. Pumping began in earnest, and with the lessons learned from the aft turret, the forward turret was also rotated to make way for another large pump. At this stage, with the final patching sections not quite yet watertight, the aim of the pumps wasn't to actually unwater the ship, but to get the worst of the hydrogen sulfide saturated water out of the ship, in order to make the eventual draining much safer, as, relatively speaking, fresh water would come in through the various bits that hadn't been sealed yet. By the start of May, the last patch sections were in place and the pumps were switched to pumping out the water properly, and concrete seam sealant was poured in to ensure the patches were as close to watertight as possible. Now, for a third time, the grim task of cleaning the interior of the ship, and inevitably recovering bodies, could begin as the water levels dropped. By mid-May, the second deck was clear and the usual mixture of rotten material and salvaged personal items began to make their way off the ship. Of course, after 2 additional months in the water, the 49 bodies found initially as the crew probed deeper were in an even worse state than those on California, and once again pumping was paused to allow the remains to be recovered, which left 21 men unaccounted for. Additional bodies were being found as the deeper parts of the ship were being cleared. Eventually, a total of 67 would be recovered, which left only 3 unaccounted for once all had been said and done. But this included some real tragedies. Men were found high in the engine rooms, and in one case in a locked storeroom, where air bubbles and working bulkhead doors had kept a number of them alive. According to the calendars they'd kept, they'd been sitting in the dark for well over 2 weeks, which was well after the divers had made their first passes on the hull, hammering on the outside looking for signs of life. But the crew inside had not been heard, and gradually their air had run out. By the start of June, however, with the removal of oil from the fuel tanks, as well as 70 tons of rotten meat, milk and cheese from the refrigerated stores area, as well as secondary ammunition, the reduction in ship's draft had continued still further, and on the 7th of June, the dry dock was made ready, whilst Dry Dock 2 released California to the repair basin. With battles with the Japanese Navy becoming more frequent, the US Navy wanted the deeper Dry Dock 2 free for any critically damaged returning ships, especially carriers, and so, just after lunchtime on the 9th, tugs guided the West Virginia over the threshold to settle on the blocks ready for an extensive hull repair, which she would need if she was ever going to sail again, in Dry Dock 1. Now, every battleship that could be realistically salvaged was in the yard's hands.